All right, it's great to be back for week 5 of TidalClub. Here we are in Dale, I think. Um, so this week is going to be focused on musical notes. There's been quite a lot of interest in the forum already about this, and we'll start looking at how notes are notated in Tidal. Things like chords and arpeggios, and I think canons, or maybe that's next week. Let's see how far we go anyway. So let's jump into Atom. This is the worksheet. Let's first think about numbers. So remember that note is how you specify a musical note in semitones. So for example, if I use the super piano synthesizer, we'll be able to hear a musical note. And if I make that a bigger number, it goes higher. So this is a pretty standard way of representing notes in terms of their number on a musical scale from 0 to 11, i.e. 12 different notes. That's how many you have in an octave, so 0 is kind of the same as 12, but 12 is just higher. That is how we've been dealing with things up to now, is sort of as numbers. And we can see if we just run note on its own, Tidal will try and tell us what that means. So this is what it's saying. You should be able to see that on your screen, but I'll just put it here so you can see it a bit clearer. Oh, it's here as well. Okay, well, never mind. 3, that's what we've put as the note. Dot 0, basically notes can be, they don't have to be whole numbers. On a piano, there's no way of playing something in between two notes. So if you try and put 12.5, it'll just round up actually to 13, I think. So if I put 12.1, it'll round it probably down. Yeah. But if I had something like a mandolin, which is like a something a bit closer to a guitar, like a little guitar with 4 strings, then you can actually, it doesn't have to be whole numbers. You can hear that's slightly different. And that's why that's 0.0 here, is that notes allow you to specify notes that aren't whole. And that F just stands for floating point, so that you know that this is a decimal number with a it's to do with how it's representing it internally. But yeah, the F just means that it's it can be something other than a whole number, really. And then this bit at the start, that's just saying, like when you run like note 13, for example, it will give you the events that are taking place in the first cycle only. And this is telling you whereabouts those are, the event is in that cycle. So it says it starts at 0 and goes on till 1, with the cycle going from 0 to 1. So basically this is a note taking up the whole of that cycle. If I put a rest here, it would say from 0 to a half. Yeah. So, and if I put another one here, it would say from 1/3 to 2/3. So it does its best at showing you that. And if I had 2 events in here, it would give me 2 out. So the 13 going from 1/3 to 2/3, and the 3 going from 2/3 to 1, which is what you see here. So that's just a quick way. If you're unsure about what's going on, you can just leave off the D1, and instead of turning that into sound, it will just print out as best it can. It even works with if you've it'll say note this shape this. That's kind of a nice alternative to the draw line thing, because draw line only works with single letters, so it'll only work if you do this kind of thing. So that's quite good for working out how it's doing the rhythms, but if you want more detail, then just miss off the D1 whatever it is. Okay, so that's what that bit's telling you. So let's sail past that. Don't know what happened to my voice then. If you're not hearing any sounds at this point, then that's because you need SC3 plugins for most of the synthesizers to work. Give us a shout if you're unsure how to find those on the forum. There are quite a few people who've gone through the process via some difficult routes, so if you do a search, you might find something that solves your problem, if you have one. I'm not saying you will have problems. Maybe you'll sail through it. It'll be fine. Right, so the part of the reason for showing you that was to show you how note names work. So this looks a bit different. So here we were doing note 3, and that told us that was a 3, which wasn't surprising. But if you do note C, it'll say note as 0. And if I put note CG, it would say note 0 and note 7. So C is the first kind of, middle C is sort of where everything else is positioned relative to. So G is 7 notes higher than C. So all of these letters from A to G, you don't get H for some reason in Western classical music, have their number. And you can use this technique of missing off the D1 to listen to them. To not listen to them, but see them, what the numbers actually are. So that's what they sound like. And that is 0794. Of course, when you run a pattern, you don't know where it's going to start because the cycle's always going in the background. A technique for getting around that is to use qtrigger. So if I do qtrigger 1, then this will reset whenever D1 is run, which is whatever you do when you run it. So that means it'll always start on that C. It'll wait a little while until the start of the next cycle before it does that. If you want it to happen really immediately, miss off the Q. Q stands for quantize. That's kind of immediate, whereas qtrigger 1 it might wait a little moment. Okay. Sometimes you miss the first one actually because it will align it to the nearest cycle. I need to think about that problem. Anyway, so this is the same as this because these each have their number. So basically, this looks like a pattern of letters or words, but actually it's a pattern of numbers. Tidal is just immediately turning them into numbers. So you can treat these as a pattern of numbers as much as you want. So A, B goes 9, 11. You might wonder what happened to 10. And that's because A sharp is 10. And you can get the sharps using just putting S after the letter. So this is C sharp, which would be the same as... let's just run it and see what it is. Yeah, so that's the missing ones. 1, 3, 6, 8, 10. So 1 is C sharp, 3 is D sharp. You can also have flats, so sharp will add 1 to whatever note you give, and flat will remove 1 from whatever you give. You might wonder why you need sharps and flats, because you could just use, there's only ever one, a gap of 1 in between these, a gap of 2 rather. So you could get to all the notes just by using sharps. So in fact, D flat is the same as C sharp. And you might ask why you need that. I'm not completely sure. I think it's something to do with some dead white guy who invented a piano or something that meant that there was no difference between sharps and flats anymore. Probably to do with the particular scale that we use in Western classical music these days. I think maybe in the past, using different scales, they would be different, but this is kind of a bit outside of my expertise, so I'll leave it at that. You can actually add, have more than one sharp. Again, this makes no sense. But C sharp, 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 sharp is actually the same as G. So it's all C, really. Everything is C. You can just add sharps to it to get any other note that you want. Okay. That was the bit that doesn't make any sense to me either. So normally there are 12 notes in an octave. So let's listen to that once more. So if we had 4 and then added 12, that would be that. And if we subtracted 12, that would be that. We can hear that they kind of sound like the same note, just shifted up or down an octave. This is to do with just doubling of the rate of playback, or the sort of doubling the frequency of the sound, so that it has the same quality but somehow is still higher. We can hear that with, for example, this. If I play it twice the playback rate, it'll go up that octave. If I keep doubling, it'll keep going up. So that's the same thing. Doubling the speed is the same as going up by 12 notes, except speed won't actually work with a synthesizer, he says. Yeah. Synthesizers ignore that. So there's no samples involved with Super Piano. It is actually synthesizing those notes using maths. I think it might have samples behind it at some point, I'm not sure. But you won't find a folder called Super Piano on your computer full of samples. This is just generating that sound for you on the fly. So there's no sample to speed up. So speed just doesn't work. Right, so yeah, so if you want to specify a different octave with this note name format, then you can do it by just putting a number after. So this is all, these are all C notes, but at different octaves. You can see it's 0, 12, minus 12, 12. And that's because 5 is the default, 6 is 12 notes higher, 4 is 12 notes lower, and we've gone back to 6 again there, and we can listen to that. Okay. Let's think about the difference between note, ends, synths, and samples. This is a little bit confusing because N and note mean slightly different things in different contexts, depending on, well, just depending on whether you're dealing with a synthesizer or a folder of samples. So with synths, you can use either note or N. They mean the same thing. So this will sound the same as this. Didn't even hear it change. So you can use those interchangeably. If you want to do something like add to this, That works. It doesn't work if you use both N and note together, I think. Yeah. Note is just winning all the time, so it's playing 3. You've got to have the same control or effect name here for this addition thing to work. But that's the only thing really. Apart from that, N and note is just interpreted the same way. For synthesizers. For samples, then it's a different scenario. So if we just take a single sample like this, it is actually pitching it up. So it's playing the same single samples because we're not using N to choose different ones, but it's adjusting the speed but in semitones. So this is an alternative to using speed here to play different notes. Oh, naught won't work. So it's doing the same kind of thing. It's speeding up and slowing down the playback of the sound so that it sounds higher or lower, but it just does the calculations so that it gets the note right. So I think they're actually tuned in at the same, more or less. So with note and N here kind of behaving the same way, except this is actually synthesizing different notes. This is playing the same sample but adjusting the speed so that they actually match. If I used N here instead, that's pretty confusing. All it's actually doing, let's have a look at those numbers again. Remember that these are really numbers, so that gets turned into 0954. So there it's actually picking different samples from that folder. So this D bass folder is full of samples made by my friend Sam Shorb. Yeah, they're all C notes of a bass synthesizer, but different parameters, I think, so that they sound different. So here it does actually make sense to specify both note and N if you want. So here it's changing what note's playing, and also which sample is being played. So that's quite nice. Maybe, for example, we could randomize this. So it's picking a different one of these at random every cycle, so adds a bit of variety. It's all good. Good. So yeah, so that's the difference. With synthesizers, either use N or note. It doesn't make sense to mix them. With samples, you can use note to pitch things up, and you can use N to pick between different samples. So as it says a bit later, with D bass, this one has is a sample, a folder full of samples that sound of different kind of timbres. They have different flavors to them, but they're all of the note C, so that you can pitch them coherently like this. You'll find other folders like this one, Rash, is full of the same timbre, the same synthesizer, with the same parameters, but all different notes. There's actually 72 of them, which is, can't do the math, six octaves of notes. I think actually there's 73, there's one extra by mistake. But I meant to just make 6 octaves, so that would be from 0 to 72. So if we listen to 0, that's really low. If we listen to 30, somewhere in the middle, 70 is quite high. So this is interesting because we've got a situation where before we were playing notes with the note thing to pitch up the single sample to different notes. But with this, we've got one folder with all the notes in. So actually, we're going to use N to play tunes. So if I put cafe in again, that's really low. So what I probably want to do is increase the octave. I can do it this way. Or I could just add that to everything. I could even pattern that addition. I could even have a different value. Sorry, I burped. So there we go. Using N to pattern a whole folder full of notes. So you can kind of treat this as a synthesizer. There's just this confusion because with synthesizers, C is middle C, and you get minus. You have to put a minus number to get lower than that, which works fine. So you can have 0 to minus 12. That works fine. But here I'm using N to pick samples from a folder. So 0 is the way I've organized it. 0 is the lowest one, and that's really low. So you have to start adding numbers to get it back up to somewhere in the middle, which is where you generally want to start, depending. There, so hopefully that's clear. Feel free to ask questions as ever. So here I'm going through that a bit slower. Yeah, I haven't made the point actually. So the advantage of having loads of samples is that if you have something like D-Bass and use that single sample to make tunes, you'll find that the higher you go, the shorter the note is. But if you've got a different sound for each note, which I'm doing with N, that's not really the case. Whether that's a bad thing or not just depends what you're trying to do. I quite like using a single sample in this way. It sounds like old school music, tracker, bedroom techno stuff. So yeah, whatever you like, try different things, see what works in what you're doing. Okay. So we've gone through that. So yeah, just remember that it looks like letters, but they're really treated as numbers. So you could use them in any other effect that takes numbers, although it wouldn't really be very helpful unless they actually relate to notes or in some way. But Tidal doesn't know that these are notes. It just knows that it's dealing with a pattern of numbers and lets you specify those with letters. Okay, so we've done that. Maybe I should have been a bit more methodical, but hey, so that's the octaves, and that's addition. So I'm actually adding 3 things together, but inside the N control. So I'm not, that's an alternative. You can either specify them as separate control effects that you're adding together, But here, this is exactly the same, but a bit less typing because I'm adding together number patterns instead of the control patterns. The result is the same. It just depends what you find most useful way of expressing it at the moment, at that time. Oh yeah, and also if you're using note, you can also use octave. So instead of adding 12, you can add 1 then. So if I just had octave 5, or octave 7 would go up to, you get the idea. That might be useful. I think that only works for, let's try it. Oh, it works for samples as well. It's quite useful. Didn't know that. Okay. Learn something every day. Okay, so that's it for notes. I'll be back in the next video to talk about chords. So I'll see you then.